occupying very similar, habitat as they do here in North America. You can see there that they're permanent residents in throughout California, Arizona, Utah, Colorado, places like that. And they do breed up in the northern regions of the United States and Canada. We took some photographs. We had some photographs in part of the PowerPoint here showing some of the typical habitat you would expect to see the golden eagle. As I mentioned before, mountainous areas, places with a lot of hills and cliffs, wide open spaces. They also have a strong preference for lakes and rivers and the borders of those regions, also around woodlands, forests, as you can see in the photographs here. Notice in the lower left, the lower right photograph here, there's a white patch that I mentioned before about on the juvenile golden eagles, and you can see them right at the base of the primaries of the wings there, as opposed to the adult bird in the upper left. All right. Okay. As far as food, these birds have quite a variety of items that make up their diet. They do tend to focus predominantly on medium to large mammals, but they will take snakes, lizards, birds. What's interesting is that in my research, it was discovered that they also take young pronghorn antelope, bighorn sheep, Olympic mountain goats, deer, just a variety of mammals, bobcats, and just incredible. Even calves, young of cattle, they will take those as well. As you can see in the photographs there, they do take ducks. They will take game birds as well, but there's also a fox that they take. They absolutely love black-tailed jackrabbits as well as hares. And what's interesting is that even though the birds are typically seen by themselves, during the breeding season, when the males and females get together and they do actually form permanent pair bonds, they will hunt cooperatively, in that one bird will distract the prey while the other bird sneaks up on the prey and actually capture it that way, and then they will share the kill together. So it's quite interesting, the strategies that they use. Part of their hunting strategy is to stay perched and look for the movement of prey, but they will also spot prey from soaring very, very high above the ground, as well as flying very low to the ground. So they combine their strategies quite a bit. Their eyesight is tremendous. They can actually spot prey up to 3 or more miles away and are able to spot the details of this prey to ascertain whether it's a prey item or not. So their vision is incredible. These birds were quite significant to the Native Americans, who actually admired the birds for their courage as well as their strength. They ascribed mystical powers to the birds as part of their religion, and even incorporated significance to the feathers of these birds, so much so that only Native Americans would be allowed to acquire the feathers of eagles as part of their religious customs. You and I, as normal, regular citizens, would not be allowed to possess the feathers of one of these birds or any part of the carcass without a permit from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. As far as courtship goes, these birds usually I mentioned before, they form permanent pair bond. Outside of the nesting season, the males and females will occupy different parts of the territory, but they do come back together during the breeding season. They actually will build the nest together. It's a joint venture, as well as incubating the eggs. Generally, the eggs clutch size is 1 to 3. They're usually white to buffy color with brown markings on them. Every once in a while, one of the eggs may not have the brown markings, but the vast majority of them do. The pairs incubate the eggs for 41 to 45 days, and after which when the young hatch, the female stays with the young for the first part of their lives while the male does most of the hunting. After the chicks reach to about the age of 5 or 6 weeks old, then the female joins the male in hunting, and so that they're able to actually increase the food supply for the growing chicks and for themselves as well. These birds are quite interesting. I have some information here regarding the conservation aspect and some interesting tidbits about them. I'll read this to you. The golden eagle populations appear to have been stable between 1966 and 2015, according to North American Breeding Bird Survey. Partners in Flight estimates their global breeding population to be 300,000, with 35% spending some of the part of the year in the United States, 15% in Canada, and 3% in Mexico. The U.S. Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act outlawed harming these birds, their eggs, and their nests. Although this legislation remains in effect, humans are still golden eagle's greatest threat. It's estimated that more than 70% of recorded golden eagle deaths are attributed to human impact, either intentional or inadvertent. Some sheep ranchers trapped, shot, and poisoned the birds into the 1980s. Some eagles have died after eating poisoned prey animals set out for controlling coyotes. Others succumbed to lead poisoning from ammunition in hunter-shot prey. Most recorded deaths, however, are from collision with vehicles, wind turbines, and other structures, or I lost my place here, or electrocution at power poles. However, new designs have been developed that, if used, can greatly reduce this risk. Urbanization, agricultural development, and changes in wildlife regimes have compromised nesting and hunting grounds in Southern California and in sagebrush steppes in inner West. Golden eagles did not prove as susceptible to poisoning from DDT pesticides as other large raptors did, probably because of their diet of mammals. The population undoubtedly declined from historical levels, but current population levels are now considered stable. These birds also may not be tolerable regarding human disturbance near nesting sites. And just to finalize this, some cool facts about the birds. Although capable of killing large prey such as cranes, wild ungulates, and domestic livestock, the golden eagle subsists primarily on rabbits, hares, ground squirrels, and prairie dogs. The amount of white on the wings of a young golden eagle varies among individuals, and a few lack the white in the wings, as I mentioned before. The golden eagle is the most common official national animal in the world. Its emblem of Albania, Germany, Austria, Mexico, and Kazakhstan, believe it or not. Because they're common prey animals, mammals don't tend to ingest pesticides. Golden eagles have escaped the harm sustained by fish eating or bird-eating raptors from DDT and related chemicals. Biologists, engineers, and government officials have cooperated in developing and publicizing power pole designs that reduce raptor electrocution. Um, Hacking an age-old falconry technique is helping rebuild golden eagle populations. Humans feed caged, lab-reared nestlings at a nest-like hack site until the birds reach 12 weeks of age, when the cage is opened and they begin feeding themselves. The fledglings continue to receive handouts from their hack site caretakers, and I was quite privileged to be a part of some of that in my work in Arizona as well. Uh, but they continue to receive handouts from caretakers for several weeks until they gain full independence in the wild. One last very interesting note, the oldest recorded golden eagle was at least 31 years, 8 months old when it was found in 2012 in Utah. It had been banded in the same state in 1980. And that covers our bird of the month for this month. Scott, if you have any questions, we'll be happy to attempt to answer those for you.
So, hi, Clive. That was great. Thank you. We have a few questions.
Okay.
And if you have more questions, please put them into the chat, and we will try to get to as many as we can this evening. So our first question is, Mimi Borge is wondering, how has DDT affected, or how did it affect the population of golden eagles in, I guess, in North America, and if you know, in other parts of the world?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, because of their dietary preference for mammals, they were not impacted by DDT as our other raptors that fed on fish and birds. Our golden eagle population tends to focus on small to medium size, and occasionally large mammals. And so as a result, interestingly enough, they were able to escape the impact of DDT on their population.
Okay, and Mary just informed me that you had already covered that during the presentation while I was distracted. I apologize.
That's quite all right.
Sue Revi asked, do the Mongolian population, or I guess people who are falconers there, do they take young eagles and train them?
They generally use passage birds. By that, I mean birds that are migrating from one area to the other, young birds converting into adults or changing into adults. They will take those birds and use them for a season or two to assist them in their hunting forays, and then they release that bird back to the wild population. They do it so well that it really does not have a negative impact on the bird identifying with humans. The training methods are so unique. I've seen a few programs on them before, so there's actually no problem with them releasing the bird after a year or two of using them for to assist their clan with hunting. And then the birds are allowed to go on living normal lives, especially with age, a lifespan of 30 plus years. Obviously, it's a very minor setback for the bird.
So at this point, there are no more questions, Clive, but we do have a comment.
Okay.
Barry Bynes, who says she also submitted a request for the golden eagle to you. So I guess her great minds, her and Cece, think alike. And
okay.
She saw one on a roadside in Utah many years ago. The bird, and then he said the bird was so tall.
Yes.
So she must have been super excited to see it. I can only imagine Barry's face when she saw that bird.
Yes, it's as I mentioned earlier at the onset of our meeting, one of the highlights of my professional career as a biologist with the Park Service was actually flying, starting in the fall. We would fly in a Cessna all over Glen Canyon counting bald and golden eagles. There were resident populations of both species, but because others migrated from northern parts of the country as well as in Canada, there was an increase in our numbers. And literally, we would be flying, we would slow the plane down enough to literally be flying just maybe about 50 feet away from these birds as they perched on the cliffs, watching us go by. And it was just phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. We didn't, I know when Mary and I were in California, we had just literally landed at the airport. We rented a car and then we were driving into San Francisco. We went through Golden Gate Park, just exiting from it. And then we saw it in a tree just over someone's house.
Wow.
And we were like, we were just aghast. And unfortunately, we couldn't stay long because the light changed, it turned green, and we had to go. So that was our golden eagle sighting.
Oh, that's amazing. That's amazing.
Yeah, but it was wonderful.
Yeah.
Anyway, so oh, by the way, there is Barry says has one more comment. Eagle counting by slow Cessnas. It's a thing. Wow. About that's incredible. I know that Dr. Mark Cook, who's on the Zoom broadcast tonight, he goes viewing wading birds on helicopters and planes, and does count via that way. So I guess counting birds from the air must be pretty common across the country.
Yeah. I was also fortunate to count bighorn sheep and several others from helicopters and all of that as well. So yeah, it's been a great opportunity for me to get out and do all that.
Well, wonderful. It was such a great presentation. Thank you, Clive.
Thank you very much.
I know the golden eagle is, it's not our bald eagle, but it's
right.
such an iconic bird.
Yes,
and of course, most of us don't get to see it because it's not a bird that's found on the east.
And I want to thank both ladies for requesting the golden eagle.
Yes, our two great minds. Yes. I agree. Thank you so much. Thank you, Clive. We'll see you again next month.
Okay, right. Take care.
Bye, Cece. Thank you.
Bye, Scott.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Now let's see how this works again. Okay. Sorry, everybody, but working on one screen, I'm a little challenged. Oops, it went all the way to the front to the first slide. Darn it. Okay. We are up to our featured program for tonight, the Flamingo Project. And I'd like to introduce Marianne Gabel, who is going to be introducing our featured speaker tonight. Marianne is also co-hosting with me. Rich Raphael, who usually does the administrative work in the background, wasn't able to make it tonight because of another commitment. So it's just been Marianne and I think we've been doing okay. And by the way, we've had 108 up to 118 participants tonight. So we're still smashing our record. I'm so excited. I'm so glad all of you are here. And it's a credit to Steve Whitfield and his program, and Clive and his program, that you all are here. So thank you to our presenters. You're the ones who make these great evenings happen. So Marianne, take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. So good evening, everyone. Tonight, we are delighted to welcome Dr. Stephen Whitfield, who's going to give us an in-depth look at the iconic flamingo in Florida. I'm sure many of you in the audience are familiar with Dr. Whitfield and the Flamingo Project of Zoo Miami. Since joining Zoo Miami's conservation team in 2015, he has been working to build a scientific basis for the conservation and recovery of Florida's iconic flamingos. We'll be getting some updates on the project this evening. Dr. Whitfield holds a PhD and an MS in biology from Florida International University, and he has more than 20 years of conservation field work. Along with his flamingo efforts, he also leads conservation research on gopher tortoises in South Florida and rare and endangered species in Central America and the Caribbean. Now, please join me in welcoming conservation biologist and flamingo expert, Dr. Stephen Whitfield. Stephen, it's all yours.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me here tonight. It's always great to talk with people about flamingos and to share some of the cool work that we're doing at Zoo Miami. Can you all see this now? Can you?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right. Let's see. All right. So flamingos are great because they are such an iconic species for Florida. If someone were to tell me that flamingos were Florida's state bird, I would easily believe them because they're so tied up with the tropical, beachy, exotic nature that Florida has. And they've been used, I mean, you can see just in these examples here, they're really used as a draw to the state. They're used on airline posters, even the state lottery. The flamingos are the icon. So I was really surprised starting at the zoo a few years ago. Oops, let's see. To see an article like this in a paper in the Florida Keys. A flamingo actually made the news as a sighting when I'd never really thought much about flamingos before starting on this project, before being involved in this project when I started at the zoo in 2015. So I was surprised to see that, that flamingos were so rare that they would be a newsworthy event. This newspaper article appeared when a rare flamingo showed up at the Naval Air Station in Key West. And this newspaper article actually asks some really good questions. Why is this flamingo here? Where is it coming from? Do flamingos actually belong here? And what's their conservation status? And it turns out that these are really important and really deep questions that aren't just from a newspaper article, but are questions that the team I was working with had been struggling to answer for quite a while. It turns out that when this newspaper article appeared, the zoo was looking for some flamingos to answer these questions and to put satellite transmitters on them to see where they're coming from, what they're doing, and try to understand more about their biology. So I was asked at this point if I wanted to come help capture this flamingo that appeared in the Florida Keys. One of the nice things about working at a zoo is that we have lots of materials to handle and transport wildlife. So we picked up our flamingo crate, which you can see here. Oops. We picked up our flamingo crate, headed down to the Keys. And in these photos, down at the bottom, you see Dr. Frank Ridgely. He's the head of conservation at the zoo. And he's the one who kind of got me first involved in this flamingo project. So we went down to the Keys looking for this flamingo at the Naval Air Station. And this flamingo was actually a problem for the Naval Air Station. You can see on the image at the bottom right, there's runways and shallow ponds kind of interspersed. And the flamingo had shown up with two others that were foraging in these ponds along runways. And then the two other birds left, leaving this one flamingo behind. And usually what the Naval Air Station does if birds are near the runways is they harass them to leave. The reason for this is because if the birds collide with airplanes, the birds can die and they can damage the airplanes. So no one wants that to happen. But this flamingo would not leave. They tried all sorts of things to get it to go away. And usually their protocol, if a bird stays in the area and won't leave, they'll end up shooting it. And no one wanted to shoot this flamingo. So they called us from the zoo to come help remove it and take it to some place where it could be safe. So this is Dr. Frank in the bottom left explaining to one of the folks from the Navy base how we're actually going to capture this flamingo. This was not the first effort to capture flamingos in Florida. As I'm sure many of you all know, there have been flamingos in the STAs for quite a while, but the numbers peaked around 2013 with up to about 147 birds at once. And the zoo and some collaborators have gone out trying to capture flamingos using mist nets, using various techniques, but nothing had worked. So we were trying to capture this one flamingo and we weren't sure how well it would go at all. This is the first day that we got out there, and you can kind of see what we're trying to do. So here's the flamingo in the shallow pond. The runway is just back there behind the pond. And we were trying to use mist nets, but it was just too windy. And we were trying to kind of get this flamingo to get close to the net so we could get him into the mist net, but there was just too much wind and he could just take off right over the nets. So this did not seem to be very effective. We reached out to someone, to Thomas Sweets at the Key West Wildlife Center. And he's a wildlife rehabilitator who works a lot with injured birds in the Keys, pelicans, herons, and things like that. And he had a net gun. So this net gun it fires a net. It's an air-powered gun that fires a net at short range. And it's never an easy thing to capture a bird in a net gun. There's always a risk that the bird will be injured. You have to get very close to the bird, and it's not an easy thing to do. So we were trying for about 2 days to capture this bird. And meanwhile, anytime we're out trying to capture the bird, they have to shut down the runways and they can't launch planes. So we were disrupting the entire operation of this naval air station to try to rescue this flamingo. And the people running the naval air station were getting less and less patient as we went through more and more methods to try to capture this bird. And this is a photo from the last afternoon we were out. We were told that if we didn't capture the bird, they were going to make an executive decision and shoot it because they've got planes to launch, they've got work to do, and they can't just wait around while we try to capture a flamingo. So we were very lucky because just after this photo was taken, we were able to capture this bird. So this is a photo of Thomas Sweets from the Key West Wildlife Center and Frank Ridgely from Zoo Miami, removing the bird from the net from the net gun. So we captured the bird. We named him Conky after the Conch Republic of the Florida Keys. We put him into our flamingo crate, and we took him briefly to the Key West Wildlife Center where they could care for him until we were able to release the bird. So we planned on keeping Conky just for a couple days and releasing him out in Everglades National Park. We had talked to some of the biologists out there, and they seemed amenable to release of the bird from another location. However, when we talked with FWC, the State Wildlife Agency, they told us at first that we couldn't release Conky. They told us that flamingos are not native to Florida, and it's not legal to release non-native species. It's actually a very good thing that you can't release non-native species in Florida, because we all know the problems with pythons, with tegus. There's lots of non-native species here. But flamingos had strangely ended up on a non-native species list, which FWC consulted and told us that we can't release the bird. So the backstory for this was that there were non-native populations of flamingos in Florida, the most famous of which is the Hialeah racetrack at Hialeah Park. And these are probably the easiest flamingos to see within the state, but they were brought there and intentionally released back in the 1920s. So I had a real problem with this because I couldn't believe that flamingos were non-native the way they were so deeply tied to the, the nature and natural history of the state. But there are lots of places where flamingos occur in Florida, and it's certainly possible that from time to time these flamingos get out and are seen in wild areas by biologists, by bird watchers. But since the 1930s, there had been sightings of flamingos all over Florida, but it was never really clear where they were coming from. This was part of the reason we wanted to capture a flamingo and put a satellite transmitter on it to see where they go. So we started, so this is really confusing because while FWC stated that American flamingos were non-native, and this was part of their law, there was also a report from the US Fish and Wildlife Service looking at priorities for wading birds in the southeastern US that actually said flamingos are native, and their populations are so low that they're in need of population recovery attention. So these are about as polar opposite scenarios for wildlife management as you can get. Are they a non-native species where we need to control the population? Or is this as a species whose population is really low and needs active protection efforts? So we started, one of the really frustrating things about this was that the information people were using to kind of distinguish between these ideas was really old. The last real efforts to evaluate what was known about flamingos goes back to 1956. So this was very old information. So I started digging to see what the oldest information I could find is about the real status of flamingos in Florida. And I love looking through old historical records for important information about biology. And so I started digging through a lot of kind of old natural history notes. And the oldest notes I could find were from John Lee Williams in a work from 1837 called The Territory of Florida. And he described large flocks of flamingos from Hillsborough Bay from before 1837. And I was really surprised to see this, but he also said that the flamingos are excellent food. The next kind of earliest record I could find was from George McCall. He was an officer with the Seminole Wars, and he was stationed near Anclote Keys, where he described hunting and eating 2 flamingos in 1827. The most famous person to observe flamingos in Florida is, of course, Audubon himself. He made an expedition to Florida specifically to look for flamingos and to collect them. And he reported seeing a flock near Indian Key in 1832. He was frustrated that he was unable to collect any flamingos on this expedition. In the late 1950s, Gustavus Verdeman, who was a biologist with the Smithsonian Institution, made a trip down to South Florida specifically to look for flamingos and to collect some. He came down to Key West and set out with a local hunter who described hunting and killing more than 100 flamingos in a single day. In the 1880s, there's a note from of the panhandle of Florida of someone purchasing and eating 4 flamingos. So this is the earliest record we have of a flamingo in northern Florida. And in the 1890s, Florida became more and more accessible. There's a report by Ingram over 3 consecutive years of reports of flamingos in Florida Bay and the Cape Sable area. And it's hard to tell from these old notes but it seems like what he was looking at are flamingos in a place you would call Snake Bite today, part of Everglades National Park. This is around the time that the plume trade was really heating up. And there's very few contemporary records of people going out with plume traders during this time. But one really important one of them is called The Cruise of the Bonton by Charlie Pierce. And he described an account of going out with plume hunters in 1885. And he said that he saw 2 large flocks of flamingos near Pigeon Key. He also reported that the going rate for flamingo skins was $25. He described this as the most expensive, for sure, of the bird skins of birds available at the time. So this shows like a really strong pressure for people to hunt these birds. William E.D. Scott in 1890 reported seeing about 1,000 flamingos near Cape Sable, and he suggested that these flamingos were there year-round. Henry Howe in 1902 described 500 to 1,000 flamingos from Florida Bay, close to Cape Sable. And this was the largest flock seen in Florida for more than 100 years, until the flock of around 147 showed up in STA2 just a few years ago. After this, the only reports of individuals had been small groups for a long time. So this is really strong evidence that flamingos historically did occur here, and that people ate them and hunted them for plumes, which explains very well how they could have disappeared in a relatively short period. This is the same kind of time period where a lot of extinctions were happening across North America. This is around the time the passenger pigeon disappeared, that the Carolina parakeet disappeared. Many game populations of birds were hunted, or birds and mammals were hunted very low. But concurrent with people writing these narrative accounts of seeing flamingos, they also collected a lot of birds for the museums or for biologists they were working for. So now it's really nice because museums are very organized and have digitized and made accessible a lot of their natural history specimens. So it's very easy to go online and do a search for any flamingos collected in Florida, for example. And when you do that, this is what you come up with. This is a list of flamingo specimens collected in Florida from around 1850 until very recently. And you can see there were a lot of birds collected through the late 1800s, but then there's very few birds collected in the 20th or 21st century, which is again consistent with the birds being historically present, but now being nearly absent. So when we put all of this information together, what we see is essentially an estimate of 1,000 to 2,500 birds within Florida. There were flocks noted by observers throughout the year, but the populations were extirpated by about 1900. So to me, this is really solid evidence that flamingos do belong here, are a native species, and the reason that they're not here anymore is because of hunting for meat and feathers. Typically, this is what we'd think of as a species that's protected by threatened species laws. It historically occurred here, was really rare, and now needs protection. Things like the Florida panther, manatees, sea turtles, all of these are species who declined greatly and have legal protections in place to help their populations recover. But that was not the case for flamingos because they were classified as non-native. We also wanted to look into evidence that the flamingos actually were breeding in Florida. They weren't just occasional visitors. And this is where the information becomes a lot harder to find. There was one observation from Alexander Sprunt, who worked for Audubon in Florida Bay in the early 1900s. And he said that one of the old timers in the Keys, Judge E.R. Lowe, reported to him an account of seeing a number of flamingos sitting on whitish stumps while he was on a hunting trip in Sugarloaf Key in 1901. And the way Sprunt interpreted this was that those whitish stumps were actually the mud nests of flamingos. There's an image of those here. Flamingos build these volcano-shaped nests out of mud. That would be a lot more typical behavior than sitting on whitish stumps. So Sprunt interpreted this as evidence of flamingos nesting as late as 1901. But this is certainly not conclusive, although it is certainly a really good hint. I wanted to find something that was a little bit more conclusive than this. And it turns out there's evidence in a really strange place. So through the late 1800s, it was a popular pastime to collect nests and eggs of birds. This was kind of like a citizen science project where people would go out, find new things, and they would write notes about them. They would trade specimens, sell specimens. And many of these egg specimens have actually turned up in museums. They're now actually a really important scientific reference for understanding the distribution, the time of year that birds breed. And these specimens have been really important for understanding things like DDT impacts on birds. Eggshell thinning, it was possible to discover eggshell thinning because we had this scientific record of eggs collected across space and time. But again, now, with museum databases being digitized and accessible, I can go online and search for flamingo eggs collected in Florida. And it turns out we found some eggs. So this is an egg you can see here. This is the name of the collector, J.W. Mann. This egg is in the collections of the Western Foundation for Vertebrate Zoology, which is often known as the Egg Museum. It's in Los Angeles, and they specialize just in bird eggs and nests. So there's a name of a collector here, a collection date, 18th of April, 1886. There's notes on the egg, which is how they recorded them at the time. And there's a description of the nest composed of dirts and roots scraped up by bird, lightly hollowed on top of ground. So that certainly sounds like a flamingo nest. There's information on who owned the eggs as they were passed around before they made it to a museum. And you can see that on the label here, the collection locality is Florida Keys. So this looks like decent evidence that flamingos nested in Florida. But that wasn't the only egg specimen we were able to find. The Harvard Museum, the Museum of Comparative Zoology, also has a flamingo egg collected in the Florida Keys in 1887. There's no name of the collector, but the records on the egg look otherwise pretty good. There was another egg specimen at the American Museum of Natural History. This one says that it was collected in Tampa in 1889. This one has the name of a collector on it, and there's pretty good information about how this egg got to the museum itself. And then finally, there were 2 eggs at the Yale Peabody Museum. These were collected at the same time. They have a collection date of June 15th, 1884. And it's not clear if this was 1 or 2 nests, but they were 2 eggs apparently collected together. And again, like all the others, the locality information says the Florida Keys. So collectively, that's 4 different egg collection events through the 1880s that seem to indicate flamingos were nesting here. And not just once, but in multiple years. So to me, that would indicate a historic resident breeding population. We were also interested in looking at recent population trends. So if the flamingos did disappear when did they start? How many of them have there been through the 20th and 21st centuries? And can that tell us anything about how they started coming back? Any trends in recent population data? So for this, we went to a different kind of resource. Now, I'm sure you're all familiar with eBird, a very easy way to record bird observations. That's become a really important reference for biologists understanding trends in biodiversity over time. But before this was digitized, people used to compile these data through Audubon field notes. So this is basically written observations of rare bird events that were compiled and published by Audubon. And these go back to the 1940s. So we went through all of these sources of information we could find. Audubon field notes, we went through Christmas bird counts and eBird, and we were able to reconstruct population trends for flamingos from 1950 to 2016. And this was a really kind of new analysis. There had been some suspicion that flamingos are becoming more common, but no one really knew for sure. So this is what we came up with. On the top left here, this is the number of people who reported flamingo observations from 1950 to 2015. And you can see that that number is increasing pretty well. This is not the number of flamingos in a observation. It's just the number of people who reported seeing them. If you look at the graph on the top right, this is the number of flamingos observed. So all of the group sizes of flamingos lumped together. And again, this shows an increase from 1950 through 2016. And then at the bottom left, this is our kind of most conservative way to estimate flamingo population size by the maximum group size seen in a year. And no matter how you look at it, this looks like an increase in the number of flamingos. So there's two ways to interpret this. Either it's a non-native species is becoming more and more common, or it's a rare species that's recovering, which would be good news. So for us to really interpret these trends, we need to be able to distinguish between the idea that birds are naturally dispersing in from somewhere around the Caribbean versus the idea that they're escaping from Hialeah or elsewhere. And we have three different approaches we can use to try to figure this out. One is looking at banding records. The second is looking at stable isotopes or other lab-based techniques like population genetics. And then the third would be to have actual telemetry data. So this first one, we know that there's been a lot of efforts to band flamingos throughout their range. There's breeding populations in the Yucatan of Mexico, in Cuba, and in the Bahamas. And there have been efforts to band birds as chicks in each of those locations. But we know that 3 birds have shown up in Florida, the first in 2002, the second in 2010, and then the last just a couple years ago. And these were all banded in the Yucatan of Mexico. In the case of one of these birds, it actually returned to the Yucatan and was spotted there again. So this is clear evidence that at least some of the birds are wild, but of all the flamingos seen in Florida over the past 50 years, only 3 of them have had bands. So where the rest of them are coming from, that remains a bit unclear. One way that we can kind of tease apart some of these differences is on the basis of stable isotopes. So this has become a really powerful tool in ecology over the past few decades. And it works because throughout an ecosystem, different elements like carbon, nitrogen, hydrogen, oxygen, all vary in their isotopic ratio in important ways that scientists can use to learn something about the environment. So for example, the the ratios of nitrogen isotopes change as you go up the food web. And the ratios of carbon isotopes vary with the source of diets. So for example, if I had a hair sample from everyone in the, on this Zoom conference, and I could analyze those hair samples for stable isotopes, I could tell you who in the audience is an omnivore, and I could tell you who is a vegetarian. I could tell you who lives in Florida year-round versus who lives here half the year and is somewhere else the other half of the year, all based on the stable isotopes in hair. And it works the same way for feathers. So stable isotopes are often used to understand where birds are migrating from, because the feathers kind of lock in a signal of the place that they were grown. And we thought we could use stable isotopes as a way to distinguish wild and captive birds based on their diets. So to do this, we collected feathers from captive birds at Zoo Miami, at the Hialeah Park, and at Lion Country Safari. And we used feather samples from wild birds in museum specimens that have been collected over the past 100 or 150 years. So we knew that wild birds and captive birds should look different. And then we thought if we took a feather sample from a bird around Florida, whose origin was unknown, we'd be able to see what it looks more like. Does it look more like the isotope signature of a wild bird or of a captive bird? So here's some of the data that we get, where these green points, these are feather samples from captive birds. And the purple points are samples from wild birds. So you can see how all the green points cluster together, which means if an unknown bird has an isotopic signature like those, it's probably captive. But if it's more closely related, if it's more similar to the purple ones, it's probably wild. So for example, this is a feather sample from Conkey, and he clusters with the purple points, not the green ones. So that's an indication that he is actually a wild bird. There's some more samples in here. This EVER 1834 is a flamingo that was found dead on Card Sound Road in 2011. This bird over here, DRTO 2018, flew into the Dry Tortugas National Park in 2018 and unfortunately died there, but we were able to get a feather sample. And then these orange points are from a number of birds that were sampled together in snake bite in 2007. And some of these actually look like they're escaped captive birds, but some of them it's hard to tell where they actually came from. So this is evidence that's telling us that a lot of birds in Florida are probably wild, but some of them may well be escaped captive birds. We're also working on some population genetics work to try to understand where the flamingos are coming from. Essentially, the way this works is very similar to 23andMe or other human genetics projects where people try to understand origin. If we take a genetic sample from Conkey, for example, and have reference samples from around the Caribbean, we can then try to find out where Conkey came from. But the most exciting way to determine where flamingos come from is actually to put satellite transmitters on them and see where they go. So I'm going to return to Conkey's story because when we gave FWC all of the information that I presented to you, we were able to convince them that flamingos do belong here and it's worth releasing Conkey out in Florida Bay. So we took him out, we put a satellite transmitter on him. It's a solar powered device that takes GPS points 4 times a day. And then every few days, it sends those GPS points to a satellite where we can download them and get the spatial data. So we released him out in snake bite. This is in October of 2015, just a few weeks after we had captured him, maybe a couple weeks. And we released him in snake bite. This is very close to the Flamingo Visitor Center in Everglades National Park. We released him there because at the time there were 2 other flamingos that appeared there. And we believed that those may have been the birds that he was with at the Naval Air Station in Key West. So we released him out there and we started to get our first spatial data. So this is a satellite image of Florida Bay. The star point is our release location. You can see the Flamingo Visitor Center just to the left of that. And then these red points are GPS points from where Conky was over the next few days. But unfortunately, just a few days after we released Conky, we got an emergency call one morning to the zoo because they had found Conky. Park staff had found him on the road, nearly dead, in the Flamingo campground. So they rushed him to the zoo. And one of the nice things about being a zoo is that we know how to take care of flamingos. We had flamingo diet on hand in our nutrition center, and we had spaces to care for Conky and help him recover. So Conky came to the zoo for a while. We had him in a quarantine pen where he was safe and could gain his strength back. And you can see from this video here, he's got on his right leg a satellite transmitter, and on his left leg a band that says US-01, because he's the first flamingo ever banded within the United States. So we took care of Conky for a few weeks until our veterinarians decided that he was healthy enough to be released. But at that point, Everglades National Park said that we can't release him in the park again because maybe he's not healthy enough to be released. So we took him out into off Isla Mirada, and we released him for a second time. And there's a nice video of us saying goodbye to Conky as we release him, if you listen for a second.
Good luck, buddy.
So we wished Conky well and set him off. And happily on his second release, he did much better. So our release point for him was right here. And he immediately flew to another island. Another one of these small islands in the middle of Florida Bay. This is what that island looks like. So this is really interesting because it's got a shallow, high salinity pond in the middle of the island, but the edge of the island is all ringed by mangroves. So if you were cruising by on a boat, it would be very difficult to see any flamingos in this pond. But that's where Conky went. So through early 2016, he started exploring more and more of the area in Florida Bay. In January of 2016, we got our first observation from some biologists who work in the park. They sent us this photo. Conky looks good. He seems to be healthy, seems to be foraging. So that was all good news. In February, he kept exploring more and more new areas. In March of 2016, he made his first visit up to Snake Bite. This was his first release location. It's an area that we know that flamingos like. And each month, he kept expanding towards more of Florida Bay. But in April, we got the first photo of Conky with another flamingo. So somehow he made a friend out in Florida Bay. In May, he continues to expand around. And we got another photo of Conky with another flamingo. Through June, he continued to explore Florida Bay. We got more images of Conky with other flamingos. And this is really important information because our satellite transmitter can't tell us if Conkey's with other birds. So these visual sightings are really important for understanding how he's doing. In July, August, September, he continues to explore more and more of Florida Bay. And so we were pretty confident that Conkey was going to do well after release because it had been months where he was doing well, exploring the bay, hanging out with other birds. It looked like a successful translocation. And the habitats that he was hanging out in were really interesting. So there were a number of different types of habitats even within Florida Bay. This upper left image is of snake bite. So this is a really extensive mudflat. It's shallow, it's tidal. The water level fluctuates each day. Whereas at the bottom right, this is one of these interior salt ponds inside one of the islands in Florida Bay. And this is really different because the water level is a lot more stable. It can be really, really salty in there. There must be really different food resources in these two types of habitats, but we really don't know why Conkey was moving between these different habitats. In July of 2017, Conkey was in snake bite, and he was found by eBird and in a place where he could be really easily seen. So we started to get lots of photos of Conkey and lots of reports of Conkey up on eBird. So here he is with two other birds in July. These photos are great because they tell us, this photo over here tells us that he's molting, which is neat to see. And then in 2017, Hurricane Irma is approaching. And while we're doing hurricane preparations at the zoo are really intense. And while we're doing everything we can to protect the animals at the zoo, we're also deeply worried about Conkey because Hurricane Irma looks like it's headed straight for Florida Bay. So the last points of Conkey we got before Hurricane Irma were from two islands out in the middle of the bay. And after Hurricane Irma, when we got power back, we were able to get data from Conkey. We see points like this, a couple of them where he's in snake bite, and one of them where he's far out on these islands. So the only way that we could have gotten points from such different places is if he flew. So we were pretty confident that Conkey survived Hurricane Irma. But after that, unfortunately, we stopped getting any satellite transmitter data from Conkey. There were a few ways we could interpret this. One is that sometimes Conkey is in deep water and we just don't get data points because his GPS unit is underwater. Another is that his transmitter failed, or the third was that he had just not survived. So we haven't had any more GPS data from Conkey since 2017, so we can pretty well rule out number one. We would have gotten data from him at some point. Whether his transmitter failed or he has not survived, that's a lot more difficult to determine. But in November of 2017, we got this photo. So this is not a great photo, but it's clearly 5 flamingos from out at snake bite. And if you zoom in right here, it kind of looks like this bird has something either blue or metallic on one of its legs. And so the easiest way for us to interpret this is that that's got to be Conkey. There's no other reason that a bird would have kind of a reflective spot like that. So we assume that Conkey survived Hurricane Irma and was last seen with 5 other birds. But this is the last time that Conkey has been sighted anywhere in Florida or elsewhere. So we really learned a lot from Conkey. We originally expected that he was going to leave Florida Bay and tell us where flamingos in Florida come from. We expected to find out that he was from the Yucatan or from Cuba or from the Bahamas, and that he'd go back there. But it was really neat that he stuck around in Florida Bay and told us the kinds of habitats that flamingos like. He told us that Florida Bay is capable of supporting, at least a handful of flamingos. So that's really neat. We took the information that we had gathered on flamingos being native to Florida, the evidence that they bred here, and the recent population trends. And we released a paper in 2018 that really tried to clarify what we know about the origins, the status and trends of flamingos in Florida. And our hope was that we could produce all of this information so that wildlife biologists can make better plans for flamingos, having accurate information. As a conservation biologist, we always hope that research will lead to effective policies, will lead to actual change. This is one indication of that change. This is the web page from FWC where they listed flamingos as a non-native species just before our 2018 paper came out. And then after that paper came out, we got a lot of press attention. Media started calling FWC and why they list flamingos as non-native. And within just a couple days, the page shifted to this. So they took down their information that that flamingos are non-native, which for us was a positive step. However, we still thought that flamingos deserve more legal protection. And so in June of 2018, we asked FWC to formally place American flamingos on the state threatened species list. This was done by a number of us from the zoo and our collaborators. And we had a number of local organizations join on to this petition in support, including Audubon Everglades. So if FWC was going to decide to list flamingos, this would be an important step. The petition would be an important step for them to kick those legal actions into gear. But in May of 2021, after a 2-year review of our petition and the information about flamingos, FWC decided that flamingos do not actually warrant protection in the state. Their justification with this is that there's less than 1,000 individuals in Florida. A very small portion of the global population for flamingos occurs within the state. And existing habitat protections and ongoing management should be sufficient. So this was really unfortunate because we do think flamingos warrant protection and warrant recovery plans. But I can also understand that FWC is in a position where they have to manage a lot of different species, and maybe they didn't want to take this one on as well. So at least there are some positive elements of the FWC report, of the FWC review. It did correct the record that flamingos are native here, does clarify that they were hunted to extinction or nearly so by people. They do state that FWC is going to step up monitoring for the species, although they haven't yet provided any details of what that looks like. And the report does identify scientific knowledge gaps, things about habitat use, how long the flamingos stay in Florida, and resolving the captive versus wild origins, which are things that we're already trying to work on to help resolve. And it says that the status of the species may change at any time if the regional situation deteriorates, if populations around the Caribbean don't do as well. So essentially, FWC said that flamingo recovery is to be encouraged, but that they won't take on the responsibility themselves because there's not a lot that they think that they can do. That is understandable, but we think that flamingo conservation is still worth fighting for. So after FWC released this, this report on flamingos, we decided that we would form a flamingo working group devoted to helping understand flamingos in Florida and finding ways to help them recover. And so I do want to talk a little bit about what a future might look like for flamingos. We showed positive trends in populations over 70 years. And it's entirely possible that if we do nothing, flamingos will eventually come back to Florida. At any time, they could fly in, find a good place to forage and nest, and they could recolonize here. There's been a number of places around the Caribbean where flamingos were hunted to extinction. They were gone for decades, and then ultimately they came back. The populations of flamingos around the Caribbean were all hunted really low around the same time that they were hunted in Florida. But a lot of the populations have recovered either with active or active conservation measures or just allowing them to recolonize. But another thing that's worked in a couple of places are deliberate translocations. So in a couple of places through the Caribbean, people have brought flamingos in and released them, and they've actually established populations. So either of these is really is theoretically possible. Translocations and reintroductions would require a lot more logistics, and it's a lot riskier of a move. But either of these could be what population recovery looks like for flamingos. We've got a lot that we're planning to continue with the project. We'd like to do some additional telemetry. We'd really like to capture one of the birds that visits STA2 to understand where they come from. We're working on population genetics to try to understand how the birds are related around the Caribbean. And one of the really important things for us in understanding any kind of population recovery is what the flamingos are eating and how they're using habitat in Florida Bay. So this is all stuff that we really think is important regardless of what a recovery scenario looks like. But I do want to give a shout out to the Florida Flamingo Working Group that we've developed and been working with over the past year. We've got a lot of great bird biologists and wildlife folks from South Florida and beyond working with us on it. And if you're interested in other updates with this project, we have a Florida Flamingo Working Group Facebook page where we share updates on flamingos, research updates, sightings around Florida. And so if you're interested in the flamingo story and where we're going from here, then I'd invite you to join the group and stay involved. A lot of people helped with this. Projects like this are rarely done by one person. So I do want to give a big shout out to lots of people who had helped us throughout the project. And I'll take any questions from there.
Great, thank you. That was that was such a deep dive into the flamingos, and I think everyone found it super fascinating, especially the way you collected data. Yeah, one person said it was very cool to see how important the bird count data is, which leads me to think, well, like, what role can, do birders continue to play in bolstering the case for flamingos?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I think about this project as kind of state wildlife agency not doing enough, and people doing a lot. For most species, we would have some kind of standard monitoring data from the state, but there's been no effort by the state, by the national parks, there's been no monitoring for flamingos anywhere. Mm-hmm. The eBird data, the Christmas bird count data even the egg collection data was done by citizen scientists, and
Right.
these are the important data sets that we have to work with. So,
Yeah, and so, right, thanks. Speaking of eggs, someone, Jeanette asked, what were the holes in the eggs?
so they would collect eggs shortly after they were laid, and the eggs was a way that they got the yolk out of them so that they would preserve, them.
Right. Let's see. Oh, and Rose wants to know, a couple of people actually wanted to know when Conky was found was found on the road, what caused the illness?
Oh yeah, I'm sorry, I can't believe I forgot that. So in the shallow ponds at the Naval Air Station, there were lots of snails. And snails are a host for flukes. When we brought Conky back to the hospital, he was pooping out tons of fluke eggs. So it looked like he had been eating lots of snails and accumulated a high parasite load. Again, one of the great things about working at a zoo is that we have flamingo medicines on hand. So it was easy for us to treat him.
Yeah.
I mean, we have spectacular veterinarians, I will say that as well. But,
you do. So when we talk about the perils for the flamingos and what they face, Anne was wondering, you found Conky near this airport runway. And these places are just inherently dangerous to birds, and then the birds are, when they're flocking, dangerous to the planes. And wildlife is just in peril around them. So are there any thoughts about closing any of these airports down in this area?
I don't know about that. I do know that airplanes can be really disruptive to the flamingos, particularly in places where they're nesting. But I would be worried about airports in or near important foraging or nesting grounds, but I don't know about. I certainly wouldn't suggest, just because a few flamingos showed up at the Naval Air Station in Key West, that's
Right.
that would necessarily be the most important flamingo habitat around.
Okay. And a few comments here, because we're running short on time. We're gonna have to wrap it up soon, but Chris says, awesome. Ria says, wonderful presentation. Daniel says, thanks, fascinating and excellent presentation. Janice says, great presentation. The details are fascinating. I would concur. The amount of data that you included really helped us understand so much the difference between or where these flamingos are coming from, and could they be native or just passerbys. Debbie wants to know, was Conky a greater or lesser flamingo?
So Conky is an American flamingo. That's the only species that occurs in North America and the Caribbean. It used to be, so the greater flamingo is in the Mediterranean and in Africa. And it used to be that the greater flamingo and the American flamingo were listed as the same species. That's why FWC's page uses the name greater flamingo, because it's an out-of-date term. And the species were split apart maybe 15 years ago. So
okay, all right. And then Anne was wondering, what did Conky's feathers tell you about where he came from? Was he year-round in Florida or a snowbird?
So I can't tell with the feather if he moved locations. The way that works with hair is because hair grows, continually. You can sample an end of the hair and the base of the hair and see if they're the same. But the feathers are all grown at once. So a feather is only one time point.
Gotcha.
All we can tell from that is that Conky is a wild bird. But we also collected genetic samples from Conky, which we have sequenced and are waiting on the analysis from. So hopefully that will soon tell us more of where Conky was from.
Okay, and then just one final question, or actually this is a comment from Kelly that she thought would be interesting for all of us. A flock of flamingos is also mentioned in the book, The Young Wrecker, a firsthand journal account, again, down in the Florida Keys. So
Interesting. I'll have to check that out.
yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. Well, thank you, Stephen. I think that'll end our Q&A. I'm going to invite Scott back on for some closing remarks.
Thank you, Stephen. That was wonderful. I don't know if I just shared my screen. I don't think I did actually.
Not yet.
Let me just do that real quickly. Okay. So we thank you, Stephen, again. Great presentation, great questions as always. And thank you so much for coming, everyone. We had to end this presentation because the library where I am hosting this meeting from is about to close. And they have already informed me that I have to be signing off very shortly. So we will be seeing you next month on Tuesday, November 2nd at 7 p.m. And at that point, you will be able to hear Robert Gundy and Nastasia Fontaine talk about their 2020 Florida Big Year, which should be so exciting. I'm anxious to hear all about it. So in the meantime, stay safe, get out there and bird, join us on our field trips, have a great rest of the evening, and we will see you next month at our November 2nd Audubon Everglades monthly meeting. Take care, everybody. Have a wonderful evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you.